Hello and welcome to Eco Show. I'm Henry and this is Eco Show. And we talk about ecology, the environment, and things happening in that space. So you're most welcome. I usually talk about an animal of the week and then talk about some research and then wrap up the show with some news. So whether you are listening to the show in a podcast format or if you're watching it, there should be some timestamps below. So if you're not feeling interested in the animal of the week this week or the research or just want to hop to the news, you can skip around as you please. So yeah, that's the guide to the show, and we will now begin. Okay, our animal of the week this week is the binturong. Its species name is Arctictis binturong. And Arctictis means bear weasel because arct means bear and ictus means weasel. And binturong is the common name for this animal in Borneo. So here will be a photo of the binturong. If you're listening to the show, then feel free to Google a photo of a binturong. The name bear weasel definitely fits because it kind of looks like a bear and it kind of looks like a weasel. It is native to South and Southeast Asia, in particular India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Sumatra, Java, Indonesia, Philippines, and it may be in some other places not mentioned there, but those are the main list of spots. And it is confined to live in tall forests. And currently it's pretty uncommon across most of that range that we just talked about. And it is becoming more endangered. It is vulnerable, and invulnerable is like a specific description for this under the IUCN, which is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, I believe, and they're the ones that say something's endangered or not. And threatened is one of their classifications. And vulnerable is one of their classifications, and that means that the species is threatened with extinction unless circumstances threatening their survival and reproduction improve. So if things continue as they are for that species, then they will be at a high risk of going extinct. So these creatures are vulnerable. And some more physical description. They've got long, and they are long and heavy. And they've got short, stout legs. So they can be up to 80 centimeters long, which is kind of close-ish to a yard long. And their tails alone can be 60 centimeters long, which is kind of like about 2 feet long. So from head to tail, these creatures are pretty, I keep calling them folks, these creatures are pretty long, and they can weigh up to 32 kilograms, which is 71 pounds. So they can be pretty thick. They have got scent glands. Here's some pretty graphic information. And when we're talking about scent glands in this case, we don't mean scent glands like the nose, but we mean scent glands like your armpits, and they have got several scent glands in their private areas for both of them. Yeah, so these are glands that smell, not that which smells. And this is from Wikipedia, so this isn't some weird obscure information that I was looking up. And apparently it smells like popcorn or corn chips. So they lucked out in the private area smell lottery amongst animals. They are active in the day and night, and they are not very nimble. Apparently they use their tails to communicate, sort of showing their behavior. And they also have shown comfort behavior, which is something that animals do to keep themselves relaxed. And these sorts of comfort behaviors can be grooming yourself, sort of like how birds pick at their feathers or primates pick bugs off each other. Grooming, stretching, and dust bathing apparently is comfort behavior, not that binturong do, but that animals do in general. And some benefits of comfort behavior are hygiene, comfort, and parasite removal. So treat yourself to some comfort behavior today. It may help you to remove some parasite or another that's treating you wrong. Binturong are omnivorous, and they like figs a lot. And one pig in particular, they're a really important disperser for, because their gut has the enzymes to digest the seed coat of this fig. So this species, binturong, is important to be able to spread those seeds around. They can live up to 25 years old, and their main threat is habitat loss via the degradation of forests. They're also threatened by the wildlife trade, and sometimes they're used as food. And there's a group in Malaysia called the Orang Asli, which apparently keep binturong as pets traditionally. So I think if you're a part of the Orang Asli group, you get a pass on keeping around a binturong, but these are cute, they're adorable, and apparently zoos really like them, so because they're an interesting animal. So when you've got zoos being the fan of an animal, you might get a sort of situation going on where people are illegally trading them. So if you're tempted from this information to get a binturong, unless you're living in one of the countries mentioned before, let's not keep that trading system going. Okay. And these would be sort of creepy to have around in your house, just imagining walking around at night and these are going around, walking around their house. There's one last thing about the tail, another cool word. Okay, and I missed this. Oh, there are two things I missed. So they have a prehensile tail, and prehensile means that it can grab things. So it's got a really strong tail, and it can hang around, and it will use it to help support itself when it's climbing and moving around, which would be fantastic. I think I would climb way more trees if I had a tail that you knew could be sort of like your backup protection. If you were to slip and fall, you could just hang on a tail. And this other thing that I missed is that they are plantigrade, which was a new word that I hadn't heard before. And plantigrade is a type of walking style. So apparently there are 3 types of walking styles. There is plantigrade, which is the most primitive, putting that in air quotes. And plantigrade is when you walk on the ground using your whole foot, which is what humans do. The second type is digitigrade, which means that you walk on your toes with the heel permanently raised. So I think that's sort of like what dogs are like, because they've got that one toe thing that's up. But let's see, who's actually digitigrade? Who have they got? They've got a wolf. They've got a wolf on here, and they're saying it's digitigrade, so I think we can say safely that dogs are digitigrade. And the last type, can you guess what the last type would be? If we say the first walking style is walking on your whole foot, the second style is walking on your toes, and the third type is walking on your nails. And so this is a weird reminder that, and that's called ungulagrade, like ungulates. So this is a good weird reminder that animals like horses and other things are walking on their nails. Pretty strange. Okay, so that was a weird sort of side note that I meant to have in a more appropriate side note place while talking about the binturong, but we can't always have it perfect. Okay, we're moving on to our research now. So our research today is from the Journal of Applied Ecology. And it does have some very applicative, some very application-worthy articles this week. Okay, so our first article is talking about bird declines and what you can do to, or what can be done to help stop these bird declines. This is by Elwyn Sharps et al. So the focus of this research is in Merry Old England, and there many birds are in decline. It's known that habitat needs to be created in farmland, but not particularly is it known how much needs to be created. So this research was looking at how much of the landscape needs to be bird friendly in order to increase populations. So they compared population growth rates of birds to the amount of habitat provisions on farmlands. So they just went through, looked at surveys of birds, what birds were around the country, and on what type of farmland. And here's what they found about the trends of those bird populations. They found that land with no habitat provisions generally led to declines in bird populations. Land with, on average, 2.3% of habitat cover for birds maintained or led to declines in at least a half of bird species. And the last type, land with 7.4% of the total area of that land with habitat on it, generally led to increases in over half of the bird species looked at. Led to increases in their population growth rate. And this 7.4% is considered a high tier scenario. So their main finding from this is that if you want to conserve bird populations on the large scale, which generally means you want to have bird populations that are increasing naturally, so then if you have to control those bird populations, you can either give out hunting licenses or use some other sort of control. But generally, with species that you want, it's desirable to have populations that have positive growth rates. So if you want that, it's best to go with a high tier situation. And I thought this article was interesting because it's looking at this landscape context of bird populations. And it's also giving some round numbers. Well, I guess not technically round, but giving some good numbers for governments to be able to implement different programs or rule changes or give out different incentives if they are wanting to target specific species. So they're finding that having that 7.4% of habitat definitely was improving for a good number of species, but there were also a number of species that needed specific help and specific habitat planted in order to increase their populations. But it's great to see a solid baseline for what you could do. And this doesn't necessarily mean you have to make it non-productive land, but you need to make 7.4% of that your landscape area. You need to make that beneficial for some birds. So it's not like necessarily giving up 7.4% of the land. Although it was looking at pasture land and land that has crops growing on it, so it might be tricky for areas with crops in particular. Having to give up 7.4% of your growing area would be, at least a 7.4% cut to your profits. So at the end of the day, a lot of farmers aren't necessarily making bank all the time. So there would probably need to be some sort of incentive in place, but this is giving some good guidelines on what you would need to do in order to lead to population increases there. Okay, keeping on the sort of agricultural landscape, we're now looking at vineyards and how they impact bee populations. And this is by Vera Wersebeckmann et al. And the titles of these articles will be, I was putting them in the podcast description, but they, for whatever reason, turn out all jumbled. So I am putting these in the YouTube video description. So if you're just looking for this, or if you're just listening to this on a podcast thing, feel free to check out the YouTube. And there you will see me occasionally put up photos and also occasionally look at the camera. Most of the time I forget to look at the camera and I'm just looking at my computer reading my notes, but I'm aiming to do better. So anyways, yeah, this article is about vineyards and bees. Agricultural intensification and abandonment of traditional farming practices is leading to insect declines. This is particularly because intensification usually leads to less habitat because you're trying to make the most out of all the land that you have. And new practices that are overtaking traditional practices tend to be growing monocrops over large areas. And back in the day, you would need to cycle things through what you're growing because different things that you could grow or have on the land would improve different aspects of your agricultural space. And that would be beneficial for insects and things because you'd have a constantly changing environment that could be beneficial for different insects at different times. So new practices have generally been not so good, and wild bees are declining. And they are pointing out in this article that although there's been a lot of focus on planting flowers for bees, there has been less of a focus on what you need to do to promote bee nests. So the researchers were trying to get a better idea of what agricultural contexts are beneficial for bee nesting. And to look at this, they looked at a wine growing area in Germany and were studying wild bee diversity. They also looked in those areas to see if different types of vines, vineyard types, impacted them. They found that landscapes with more nesting resources improved wild bees more than flower resources. And bees usually either are nesting on the ground or in some sort of herbaceous spaciousness. So for these nesting sites for ground species, looks like just bare ground, and hedges and woody elements like abandoned vines or abandoned vineyards were good for above ground bees. So I like research that has this combination of practical advice, which in this case was promoting nesting habitat for bees. And I also like when research articles are bringing up an overlooked issue like nesting bees. Or bee nests, because that's not something I would have thought about as a consideration for bees as much before, I guess, because there's sort of an assumption that most bees or that there's going to be a lot of bees in honey colonies or things like that, but having the focus on wild bees and what they need to do to thrive is very sweet. Next article. We're staying in this. I really like this journal this month. There are so many good articles in there. This is the article is called Journal of Applied Ecology, and it definitely was very applied, and it feels really good. when you're reading about applied ecology, because they have to find a problem to solve, and they're solving them, let me tell you. Okay, so our next article, our third research article today, is still talking about agricultural practices, but it's not looking at landscape so much. So the researcher, the main name on the article is Fabian A. Boetzl et al. So there's other people. Et al. Just means there's other people who worked on this, but we don't have enough time to read their names. So this article was looking at what is the impact of undersowing oats with clover. So undersowing means you have your oat crop grown in lines, or however you're going to grow it, and then in the spaces between those lines, you're going to plant another plant. In this case, clovers were being planted, and we're looking at what the impacts of planting those clover in between oats was. So we're looking at what the impacts of planting that clover in those in-between spaces is on pollinators and weeds. They found that by sowing clover beneath oats, there was less weed cover, there were more pollinators, and there was less root-feeding nematodes. So those are all some beneficial things about our oat fields and growing clovers beneath them. So clover is this nice little green thing, green growing plant, which sounds like it has flowers. In my mind, at the moment, I'll put up a photo, but I don't have in my mind an image of what a clover flower would look like. So if you're just listening, feel free to Google clover flower. Okay. There were some downsides, unfortunately. And they found that when you sowed clover in between lines of oats, there were less spiders, and oats had lower yield nitrogen content. And nitrogen, in the context of oats, relates to the protein amount in the oats. And if you're farming different grains, the quality of your grain is very important. So I'm not sure if the impact of this was enough to be really detrimental to that nitrogen content, but it did impact it. The interesting thing is that clover, which is a legume, fixes nitrogen, which means it's making nitrogen generally available to plants. So I wonder if they planted at a different time, if it would be more beneficial for oats. I imagine it would be. Because usually people, when they're doing something called cover cropping, you are planting seeds that will improve the soil quality for your next crop. So maybe there's another sort of plant that they could grow that wouldn't take away nitrogen, because at the end of the day, for farmers, that quality is going to be important, the oat quality. And they found that there were no impacts associated with growing clover between our oat crops. There was no impact on root diseases, pest damage, natural pest control, or crop yield. So you still got the same amount of oats, but it just wasn't necessarily as good a quality, which you're not going to be able to get away with. There was no impact on root diseases, so even though you had less parasites, it sounds like there was still the same number of root diseases, and this didn't change pest damage, so it didn't promote or deter pests from eating oats. And that's about all we have on that one. That might be our last research article. Yes, it is. I think 3 feels pretty good to me. I think any more than that, my brain starts to feel mush. So our major takeaways from this one is that you should experiment with cover crops like clover, growing those in your, you might even be able to grow those in your garden in order to not use fertilizer. So try growing some clover and then chopping it down or blending it into the soil before you start growing any oats or anything else, so that it doesn't take away the nitrogen, and it should leave a good amount of nitrogen in the soil if it's dead when you're planting things. So that's takeaway number 1. Number 2 is to look at what bees you may have in your community or where you're living, and how could you create bee nests, because they were saying in our second article that bee nests are much more beneficial for wild bees than planting flowers. And our last one, or our first one, I should say, which was about farmland birds, is that if you happen to have space in your living area, maybe you could see what would 7.4% of your yard space look like, and could you grow trees or something like that for any populations of birds that are in decline. So those are some practical things to think about from those research articles. We're not just a pie in the sky this week. We are a pizza on a plate. On to our news section now. Our first news article is that apparently plants make sound when they are under stress. The sound range can't be heard by humans, but they set up this research on plants where they set up ultra-sensitive microphones and recorded the sounds of plants under stable conditions. So in just a sort of soundproof space with no extraordinary plant conditions. And then they recorded plants when they were still in a secluded place, but when they were under pressure from heat or water. And they found that unstressed plants make less than 1 sound per hour, and stressed plants make more than a dozen. And I think it was possibly like a dozen every 10 minutes or something like that. But either way, even if it is a dozen an hour versus one per hour, that is a big increase. And then they repeated this study, but they did it in a busy greenhouse and found that the sounds were still detectable and they weren't completely blurred out by other sounds. So this was showing that, so I guess this is a research article as well, but I found it in a news space. So birds can make sound. I guess the next step would be, so birds can make sound and it can be detected even in loud environments. And I guess the next thing would be, I wonder if plants can detect that sound from one another. Okay, next thing. Insects have been approved as food in Europe. And these insects include mealworms, crickets, and locusts. They have protein and many nutrients. We've got so many different world issues going on that I think it seems like it would be a good investment at this point to put in for some infrastructure to be able to harvest locusts. Because I think we all know we're due for a big locust situation. So rather than being like, oh no, it's locust plague, prepare for it, guys. Prepare for the locust plague. Get a whole bunch of maybe UV lights or something like that to attract them. Locust burgers. I'll try it. It'll probably be good. I'm sure you could make it into something tasty. So these insects have lots of protein and many nutrients. And now they're going to be put in things. I'd rather just eat them as is than have them be necessarily made into something else. I'm not excited about the idea of cricket bacon or something like that. I'll just eat it straight. I've heard that crickets are pretty good. Next article. Next news story. Motionless wind turbines are being developed, or external motionless. So the usual wind turbines or big windmills that generate energy are loud and can cause issues like bird strike and things like that. But these motionless ones are pretty cool. I don't completely understand it, but basically these motionless wind turbines are like, I'll put a photo of them up, this motionless wind turbine. It just looks like a big air conditioning unit or something like that. But when air flows by it, there are little wings, and when air flows over these little wings, it moves and this is like legitimately a wing, like a small wing. And the thing that makes wings raise up has to do with the rate that air is moving over the wing. I definitely don't have an understanding of it to describe it here, but plane goes up because of a difference in pressure underneath the wing, and that's due to the shape of a wing. And so this technology is taking advantage of this, and it has a lot of little wings that air will flow over, create pressure such that a big turbine inside this unit, and so a big thing that can spin, is then made to spin by the difference in pressure created over all of these small wings And this is much smaller than big turbines. It can be used in cities, and there's less animal danger associated with it. So always cool to see new technology being developed. I hope that wasn't a super incorrect description of plane wings, but I think that's pretty close. Air pressure difference is what's being created. And so the shape of a wing causes that. I'll put up a photo or a diagram that describes what's going on with a wing, but it's probably worth watching a 10-minute YouTube video on it to describe it. It's a pretty cool technological innovation. Like if the world restarts, that's something you want to know. You know, what's the basic what's going on behind a wing. That's some good understanding to bring in. Okay, we've got 2 more news articles. There is a water cleaner that's going around being used, I think, in London. These people are using it. It's like a Roomba for the water. So it goes around in the water. It's designed like a whale shark, apparently. And it moves slowly through the water and captures trash. It can get up to 500 kilograms of debris per session. And it also takes water samples while it moves through the water. Apparently, it also moves too slow to catch fish and birds. So birds and fish, don't worry about this thing. 500 kilograms of debris per session is going to be over 1,000 pounds. So that's a lot of debris. I wonder how long it will take to develop something that can filter microplastics out of water, or if that would even ever be possible. But this may be coming to a city near you soon enough. And our last news article is that some researchers in Australia have found a way to extract more ingredients from solar panels. So apparently disposing of solar panels can be very wasteful, and these researchers have found a way to make it less wasteful by extracting ingredients from them. So always good to know that there are people out there doing things. Like I said last week, there's so many opportunities to have a successful discovery and possibly a successful business from looking at a modern problem and finding a modern solution to that problem. So may you take modern solutions into modern problems this week, and we'll catch you all next time. Thanks for checking in. Bye.